"You're in the wrong building, buddy. This is for real cops, not rent-a-cops." Without slowing, Officer Bryce Lennox flipped a creamer cup over the man's head. White liquid ran down his hair as laughter exploded from the window table. In the doorway, Sergeant Frank Nolan watched with a satisfied smile. Captain Jeremy Cole, the man at the table, didn't move. He didn't flinch or raise his voice. Instead, he quietly reached for a napkin and wiped his face with the unhurried calm of someone who had already decided exactly how this week was going to end. The laughter only grew louder. They mistook his calmness for weakness. But what nobody in that cafeteria understood was that they had just humiliated the man who held every single one of their careers in his hands. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. It always did. Nobody complained. Complaining wasn't something you did at the 9th Precinct. Not if you were smart. Not if you wanted your shift assignments to stay the way they were. Sergeant Frank Nolan stood at the center of the room like he owned it. Because he did. He leaned against the counter with his coffee mug in one hand, the other tucked in his belt, and he talked. Loud. Easy. The kind of man who never once wondered whether people actually wanted to hear what he had to say. Officers Lennox, Ellison, and Holt sat around the break room table. 3 other officers stood near the door. They all laughed at the right moments. They all nodded when nodding was expected. They had learned, the way you learn things in a place like this, that keeping Frank Nolan happy was simply how you survived. Nolan was 47 years old, 22 years on the force. He had a thick neck, a permanent smirk, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once faced a real consequence. He wasn't the captain of the 9th Precinct. His name had never appeared on that door. But everybody, from the newest rookie to the oldest desk sergeant, understood the truth of this building. Frank Nolan ran it. Captain Roy Jackman had retired 6 weeks ago. Good old Roy, who never rocked the boat, never asked uncomfortable questions, and never once told Nolan no. In the 6 weeks since Roy walked out the door, Nolan had made himself right at home in the power vacuum. He'd started deciding shift assignments personally. He'd overridden 2 HR memos without explanation. He had taken to referring to himself, casually and often, as acting captain. He had no such designation. He didn't seem to care. "You know what Roy's problem was?" Nolan said, swirling his coffee. "No backbone. The man couldn't discipline a parking meter." He paused for the laugh. "Got it." Ellison nearly choked. Lennox grinned and leaned back in his chair like he didn't have a worry in the world. Bryce Lennox was 29, built wide and mean, the kind of young who hadn't grown into himself yet, and probably never would. He had found Nolan early in his career and attached himself like something that doesn't let go. Nolan liked having Lennox around. He was useful that way. Gary Ellison was older, 51, red-faced. The bitterness baked so deep into him that it had stopped looking like bitterness and started looking like personality. He believed, in the marrow of his bones, that 20 years of service entitled him to say and do exactly as he pleased. Stacy Holt sat at the end of the table and laughed along quietly. She'd learned early that laughing along was the only way to avoid becoming the subject of the joke. "New captain starts today," said a duty officer passing through the doorway, not stopping, not making eye contact. Nolan didn't miss a beat. "Yeah." He waved a hand like he was shooing a fly. "I know." He had done his homework on Jeremy Cole the same way he did his homework on all of them. Pulled the file, read it twice, looked for the weaknesses. State-level transfer. Administrative background. No street experience. No precinct relationships. No history in Hargrove City. Diversity hire, Nolan had decided. Plain and simple. He'd seen the type before. All paperwork and politics. No real authority. No idea how a precinct like this one actually functioned. They always came in wanting to change things. They always left tired and beaten, wondering what had hit them. The ninth had eaten 3 captains in 8 years. Nolan had helped with every single one. State-level desk job, he continued, his voice warm with amusement. Man hasn't worked a real shift in years. Probably doesn't even know how to fill out an incident report without his secretary doing it for him. The room laughed again. Ellison leaned forward. How long you give him? Nolan thought about it for exactly 1 second. 6 months. If he's tough, he smiled. He won't be tough. He raised his coffee mug toward the center of the room. A toast, slow and deliberate. The kind that said, nothing changes here. Not today. Not ever. Lennox raised his own cup. Ellison followed. Even Holt lifted hers, just slightly. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly in the quiet. Somewhere behind them, through the building's side entrance, a door opened and closed with barely a sound. Nobody noticed. Nobody turned around. Jeremy Cole had been watching men like Frank Nolan his entire career. He knew how they moved. He knew how they laughed. He knew the particular way they held a room, loud and loose and completely sure of themselves, right up until the moment everything fell apart. He stepped through the precinct's side entrance at 8:02 a.m. and let the door close quietly behind him. He was not wearing his uniform. No gold bars, no captain's insignia, no pressed navy blues that would have announced him the moment he walked in. Instead, he wore plain khaki trousers, a dark polo shirt, and a small generic patch on his left shoulder that read, Port Security Unit, in plain block letters. The kind of thing you'd see on a contract worker. The kind of thing that made people's eyes slide right past you. That was exactly the point. He picked up a tray at the cafeteria line, chose scrambled eggs and toast, poured himself a black coffee, and carried everything to a steel table near the far wall. He sat down. He opened a small notebook beside his tray. He picked up his fork. And then he simply watched. 3 months ago, Deputy Chief Anita Dean had pushed a thick folder across her desk without a word. Jeremy had opened it and read every page while she waited. 6 dismissed complaints in 4 years. 3 officers who requested transfers rather than fight. A paper trail full of holes where real records should have been. And then there was Evan Washington, 29 years old. Outstanding academy record. Assigned to the 9th full of purpose. By month 3, the worst patrol routes in the district. By month 5, written up for things white officers did freely. By month 8, gone. 2-sentence resignation letter and a man who boxed up his uniform and tried to forget everything. Jeremy closed the folder slowly and looked up. Dean hadn't touched her coffee since he walked in. Tell me about him, Jeremy said. Not the file. Tell me what the file doesn't say. She looked at the window briefly, then back at him. Frank Nolan is not stupid. That's the first thing you need to understand. He looks like a loud, small man, and that makes people underestimate him. They stop paying attention. That's exactly what he wants. She folded her hands on the desk. He has spent 22 years building a network inside that precinct. Officers who owe him favors. Officers who are afraid of him. Officers who have done things they don't want anyone examining too closely. He holds all of it right here. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. What about outside the precinct? Gerald Dolson. She said the name like a headache that wouldn't quit. City councilman. Chairs the police funding committee. Any formal action against Nolan that makes noise at the city level gets complicated very fast. How complicated? 3 captains in 8 years is complicated. She held his gaze. He will not come at you directly. That's not how he works. He'll bury you in paperwork. He'll go to the union. He'll use Dolson to make noise in the press. And he'll stand in the middle of all of it with clean hands. And that smile of his. She paused. He has done it before. Evan Washington, Jeremy said quietly. Something shifted in her expression. Just slightly. Evan Washington had more potential than anyone we put through the 9th in a decade. He's working at an auto parts store now. Won't return my calls. The room was very quiet. Jeremy looked at the folder one last time. Then he looked up. Give me 1 week. Now he sat in their cafeteria, eating their eggs, taking the measure of everything around him. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, settled, with the particular stillness of a man who had long ago made peace with difficulty and stopped flinching at it. 28 years on the job. 4 of those years on a federal task force where impatience got people killed. He worked methodically. Badge numbers against faces memorized from personnel files. Who deferred to whom? Who sat alone? Who laughed too hard? And who laughed too carefully? The loud table by the windows confirmed everything. Lennox, Ellison, Holt. The architecture of the problem was already visible. The ringleaders, the followers, the one who laughed, but wasn't really laughing. He wrote quietly in his notebook. Facts, times, names, nothing dramatic. He took a sip of coffee. He was perfectly still, in the way that very calm, very dangerous people are still. Not passive, not idle, but coiled, patient, waiting for exactly what he knew was coming. He was almost finished with his breakfast when the air in the room shifted. A chair scraped back from the window table. Bryce Lennox stood up, nudged Ellison, and tilted his head toward Jeremy's table. Somebody let the security guard into our cafeteria, he said. The table laughed. Jeremy kept eating. Bryce Lennox didn't walk over to start a fight. That wasn't the point. The point was the audience. The point was the 6 officers at the window table watching him cross the cafeteria with that loose, easy grin on his face. The point was Frank Nolan, standing in the doorway with his coffee, watching the whole thing with quiet approval. Lennox was the kind of man who needed witnesses. His cruelty didn't feel real to him unless someone was watching. He reached the condiment station beside Jeremy's table. He didn't say anything at first. He just picked up a small metal creamer cup, the kind with a foil peel tab on top, and held it loosely between 2 fingers. Casual. Like he'd just grabbed it on his way past. Jeremy had his fork raised halfway to his mouth. Lennox peeled back the foil tab, and he turned the cup upside down over Jeremy's head and poured it. Slow, deliberate, every single drop. The table by the windows exploded. Ellison slapped the table so hard the coffee cups rattled. 2 officers behind him doubled over. Holt pressed her hand over her mouth, not out of shock, out of the effort of containing how hard she was laughing. One young officer near the door turned away, shoulders shaking. Nolan, still in the doorway, did nothing. He just smiled. Jeremy went completely still. Not the stillness of a man in shock, not the stillness of someone afraid. It was a different kind of stillness altogether. Deep, deliberate, and somehow more unsettling than any reaction could have been. His fork stayed in his hand. His eyes stayed on his tray. He set the fork down. He reached out and pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser beside his tray. He brought it to his face. He wiped the creamer from his forehead, from his cheek, from the side of his neck. Slowly, carefully, the way a man wipes his hands clean after finishing a job. The laughter was still going. Lennox stood over him, grinning wide, looking back at the table to make sure everyone was still watching. They were. He leaned down toward Jeremy. Close. You're in the wrong cafeteria, buddy. This is for department personnel. Not rent-a-cops. More laughter. Jeremy finished wiping his face. He folded the napkin in half and set it beside his tray. And then he looked up at Lennox. Not with anger. Not with embarrassment. with something far quieter than either of those things. He looked at the badge on Lennox's chest, read the name printed on it, and then he looked directly into Lennox's eyes. "I know," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Enjoy your breakfast, Officer Lennox." The grin on Lennox's face flickered. Just for a second. Just the briefest hesitation, like a man who hears a sound he can't quite identify. He hadn't told this man his name. The patch on his chest said Lennox, but that wasn't something a security guard would normally read. Not like that, not casually, not with that kind of ease. But the moment passed. The table was still laughing. Lennox straightened up, looked back at his audience, and spread his hands wide. See? Nothing. He sauntered back toward the window table and dropped into his chair like a man who had just done something worth doing. Nolan pushed off the doorframe and disappeared back into the hallway. Satisfied. The cafeteria noise filled back in around Jeremy like water closing over a stone. He sat for a moment. Still. Quiet. His breakfast sat in front of him, cooling now. He didn't look around the room. He didn't track the laughter. He didn't watch Lennox settle back in among his friends and replay the moment for the ones who missed the best angle. He reached into the pocket of his polo shirt and pulled out his small notebook. He opened it to a fresh page. He wrote one name, Lennox. He looked at it for a moment. Then he capped his pen and slipped the notebook back into his pocket. Across the cafeteria, near the far windows on the opposite side of the room from the loud table, Officer Dawn Keller sat alone with a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk. She had watched the whole thing without moving. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't looking away either. She was watching Jeremy with a focused, careful expression, the look of someone trying to solve a problem they don't yet have all the pieces to. Jeremy picked up his fork again. He felt her watching. He glanced up briefly and met her eyes across the room. Neither of them said a word. He looked back down at his breakfast and kept eating. The briefing room filled up the way it always did. Loud near the door, quieter toward the back. The window table crew, Lennox, Ellison, Holt, claimed the same 3 seats they always claimed. Center left, close enough to the front to look engaged without actually being engaged. Coffee cups scraped against the long table. Someone's radio crackled and was turned down. The usual low current of side conversations ran around the room like water finding its level. Nobody paid much attention to the man already standing at the front. He was in the same polo shirt from the cafeteria, the same plain khaki trousers, the port security unit patch on his left shoulder. He stood with both hands loose at his sides, not moving, not checking his phone, not doing anything in particular, just standing there in the quiet way that certain people stand, taking up exactly the space they need and not 1 inch more. Lennox glanced at him and looked away. He leaned toward Ellison. "Why is the security contractor in our briefing?" Ellison shrugged without interest. "Probably hear about the parking lot cameras. Just ignore him." Lennox did. The room kept filling. A few officers threw a second glance at the man near the podium and arrived at the same easy conclusion. Maintenance, contractor, building services, someone from Fleet. And moved on. It was the polo shirt that did it. The absence of a real uniform. People see what they expect to see, and nobody at the 9th Precinct expected anything that morning except the same thing they got every morning. Nolan came through the door at 8:58 with 2 minutes to spare. He did a brief scan of the room the way he always did, checking attendance, checking posture, confirming the order of things, and his eyes moved across the man at the front without stopping. He set his coffee down. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table. He was just about to sit when the door opened again. The room changed immediately. Not because of a sound or a word. It changed the way a room changes when someone walks in who outranks everyone present. A quiet, involuntary shift, like a current running beneath the floor. Side conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone straightened in their chair. Someone else put their phone face down. Deputy Chief Anita Dean walked to the front of the room in full-dress uniform, shoulders back, eyes forward, and stood beside the man in the polo shirt. Nolan's hand was still on the back of his chair. He didn't sit down. Dean did not look at him. She did not look at anyone in particular. She stood and waited, and the waiting itself was a kind of pressure, clean and steady and completely controlled. She had clearly done this before. She was clearly not in a hurry. The room reached full silence in about 10 seconds. Lennox's eyes moved to the man beside her. Back to Dean. Back to the man again. He found himself looking more carefully this time, at the way he stood, at the particular quality of his stillness, at the fact that he was meeting nobody's gaze because he didn't need to, because he was completely, entirely unbothered by any of this. Something cold moved through Lennox's chest. He thought about the cafeteria, the creamer cup, the way the man had looked up at him, not scared, not embarrassed, just steady. The way he had said Officer Lennox, like he had always known the name, like it was already filed somewhere inside him, already recorded. "Enjoy your breakfast, Officer Lennox." Lennox's jaw tightened. Ellison leaned forward slightly in his seat, elbows on the table. Holt had both hands wrapped around her coffee cup and was staring at the surface of the table. Nolan stood very still beside his chair. Dean let the silence run exactly as long as she wanted it to. Then she spoke. "Officers of the 9th Precinct." Her voice was unhurried and clear. The voice of a woman who had never once needed to repeat herself. "I'll keep this brief." She turned slightly toward the man beside her. After a thorough selection process conducted over the past 3 months, the 9th Precinct has a new commanding officer, effective as of this morning. She paused. 1 beat. 2. Captain Jeremy Cole. 28 years of distinguished service. Former liaison to the FBI Organized Crime Task Force. 3 department commendations for integrity in command. She let that land. "Many of you," she continued, and something in her tone shifted just slightly. Not warmer exactly, but more deliberate. "Have already had the opportunity to meet him this morning." Her eyes moved briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward the window table group. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. This one had weight. It pressed down on specific people and pressed down hard. Lennox felt the blood leave his face. Ellison's jaw went slack. Holt looked up from the table and then immediately looked back down. Nolan said nothing, did nothing. His expression had stopped being an expression and had become something else. A careful, rigid blankness, the face of a man performing composure while the floor dropped out beneath him. Dean stepped to the side. "I'll let him take it from here." Jeremy Cole walked to the podium. He moved without urgency. He set both hands on the edges of the stand and looked out over the room. He did not look like a man who had just been revealed. He looked like a man who had simply been waiting for the right moment to step forward. And the moment had arrived exactly on schedule. He found Lennox first, held his gaze for 2 long seconds, then Ellison, then Holt, then, last and longest, Frank Nolan. Nobody in the room made a sound. "Good morning," Jeremy said. "I've already had a chance to get acquainted with some of you." He let that sentence stand alone for just a moment. "I look forward to getting to know all of you, properly, over the coming days." He didn't smile. He opened the folder in front of him and moved directly into the briefing. Shift assignments, patrol route updates, 2 pending case reviews. He was thorough and precise, and completely at ease. He ran the entire briefing the way a man runs something he has run 100 times before, without hesitation, without notes, without a single moment of uncertainty. Nobody said a word that wasn't asked of them. When it was over, the room emptied fast. Officers moved with their eyes down, conversations barely above a murmur. The air had changed in the building. Everyone could feel it, though no one could have said exactly how to describe it. Nolan's face, throughout the entire briefing, had been the color of chalk. In the back row, Dawn Keller let out a long, slow breath. It was the first full breath she had taken all morning. Something had shifted. She could feel it in the room the way you feel a change in weather. Something was different now. Something had started. She gathered her things and stood. At the front of the emptying room, Jeremy closed his folder and straightened his notes. He did not look triumphant. He did not look relieved. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had prepared for this moment for a very long time, and was only just getting started. The briefing room emptied fast. Officers filed out in clusters, heads down, conversations tight and low. The air had changed in the building. Everybody felt it. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Chairs scraped. Boots moved quickly down the hallway. Within 4 minutes, the room was nearly clear. Jeremy stood at the front, closing his folder, unhurried. Frank Nolan was still there. He had hung back near the far wall while the others filtered out, and now he crossed the room with a different walk than the one he'd had this morning. Slower, more measured. He had recalibrated somewhere between the door and the podium, and what he was wearing now was a performance of ease. The particular ease of a man who wants you to believe he isn't threatened. He extended his hand. "Captain Cole." His voice was warm, practiced. "Frank Nolan. I've been keeping things running around here since Captain Jackman retired. I wanted to introduce myself properly." Jeremy looked at the hand. Then he shook it. "Sergeant Nolan," he said. "I know who you are." Something moved behind Nolan's eyes. Brief and quickly buried. "Good, good. Well, I just want you to know, I'm here to help. 6 weeks running this place on my own, I've got a pretty solid handle on how things operate. The relationships, the rhythms. Every precinct's got its own way of doing things, and the 9th is no different." He smiled. "I'd love to bring you up to speed. Help you get settled." Jeremy nodded once. "I appreciate that, Sergeant," he said. "I'll call on you when I need you." A pause. Nolan's smile held perfectly steady. "Of course. Door's always open." He left. Jeremy watched him go. Then he turned back to his folder and made a small, quiet note. 20 minutes later, Nolan found Lennox near the equipment lockers. "Relax," he said, before Lennox could open his mouth. He shook my hand, smiled. "Didn't say a word about this morning." He crossed his arms. "Man's a pushover. Came in wanting to look reasonable, make a good first impression. He's not going to rock the boat over a creamer cup." He lowered his voice slightly. "We play it calm. We play it normal. And he'll spend his first 3 months drowning in paperwork, wondering why nothing works the way he expects it to. Just like the others." Lennox exhaled. Nolan clapped him on the shoulder and walked away. He was smiling again. At 2:00 p.m., Jeremy opened his office door and leaned into the hallway. "Officer Keller." Dawn looked up from her desk. Around her, 2 other officers glanced over briefly, then back at their work. "My office, please." She stood, smoothed her uniform, and followed him in. He closed the door behind her. The blinds on the interior window were already angled shut. She stood near the door, hands at her sides, waiting. Jeremy went to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer, lifted out a thick manila folder held shut with 2 rubber bands, and set it on the desk between them. "Sit down, Officer Keller." She sat. He nodded at the folder. She leaned forward and pulled the rubber bands off and opened it. She went still. Inside was everything. Photographs of incident reports. Dated complaint forms with big red dismissed stamps across the top. Personnel records with notes in the margins. A full timeline stretching back 6 years. Evan Washington's file, complete and flagged with a yellow tab. Transfer requests. Pattern analyses. Names she recognized. Dates she recognized. Things she had seen firsthand and convinced herself nobody was documenting. All of it. Documented. "I've been building this for 3 months, Jeremy said, "before I ever set foot in this building. This morning was part of that." He paused. "You watched what happened in the cafeteria. It wasn't a question." "Yes," she said quietly. "I need someone on the inside who knows this precinct. Someone who has seen what I've documented and can confirm it from direct experience." He slid a second, smaller document across the desk. "That is a formal internal affairs cooperation agreement. It protects you legally and places your testimony on an official record." Dawn looked at the document, then up at him. "They'll know," she said. "If I start talking, Nolan will figure it out." "Yes," Jeremy said, "eventually. That's why the case has to be airtight before he does." She looked down at the agreement. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Coming into places like this?" "This is my 4th posting like this one," he said simply. "I've never lost." She picked up the pen. Through the angled blinds, just barely visible, Frank Nolan stood motionless in the bullpen outside, watching the closed office door. His smile was completely gone. Tuesday morning came in gray and cold. Jeremy arrived at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the first shift. He made coffee in his office, reviewed the duty roster, and had 3 case files open on his desk before most of the building had their coats off. He moved through the precinct the way he always did, quietly, attentively, missing nothing. Frank Nolan watched him do all of this, and then Nolan got to work. It started small. That was how Nolan always started. By 8:15, the precinct's internal mail routing had been quietly adjusted. Administrative reports that should have landed directly on Jeremy's desk were now cycling through a secondary processing step, an extra approval layer that Nolan had inserted into the system under the guise of streamlining the transition period. The result was a backlog, not a dramatic one. Not the kind anyone could point to and call a sabotage. Just enough friction to keep Jeremy buried in paperwork for hours every day. By 9 hours, Nolan had made 2 phone calls to the precinct's union representative, a soft-spoken man named Zachary Phillips, who owed Nolan 3 favors and knew it. The calls were casual, friendly, the kind of conversation that doesn't sound like anything until you understand what's being planted. Nolan suggested gently that Jeremy's Monday morning cafeteria visit, arriving unannounced in plain clothes, observing officers without identifying himself, might be worth examining from a protocol standpoint. "Just raising questions," he told Phillips. "Just making sure the union is aware." Phillips said he'd look into it. Nolan hung up satisfied. By 10 hours, he had found Lennox. "Listen to me carefully," Nolan said, voice low, back to the wall in the equipment corridor. "He didn't write you up yesterday. That means one of 2 things. Either he's letting it go, or he's saving it." He held Lennox's gaze. "Either way, you do not apologize. You do not acknowledge Monday morning in any form. You didn't do anything wrong. You encountered an unidentified individual in a staff-only space and responded accordingly. That's the story. And if he brings it up directly?" "He won't," Nolan said. "Not yet. He's playing the long game, so we play longer." What Nolan didn't see was what was happening on the other side of the building. Jeremy had scheduled individual orientation meetings with every officer in the precinct. 31 people over 2 days, 15 minutes each, framed as a simple introduction. Getting to know the team. Understanding the precinct's needs. The kind of thing a new captain does. That was how it looked from the outside. From the inside, each meeting was something else entirely. Jeremy sat across from every officer with the same calm, open expression, and asked the same careful questions. About their experience at the 9th, about what was working, about what wasn't, about what they wished leadership understood. Most of the senior officers gave him nothing. Polite, closed, practiced. They had learned to give nothing. But the junior officers were different. A 26-year-old named Officer Tanya Morris came in for her 15 minutes and left after 40. She spoke carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all. She described her first 6 months at the 9th in a steady voice with her hands clasped tight in her lap. Missed promotions with no explanation. A formal complaint she had filed 8 months ago that she'd never received a response to. A shift schedule that seemed designed to isolate her. Jeremy listened without interrupting. He took quiet notes. He thanked her when she finished and told her she had done the right thing. She looked at him like she wasn't sure she believed that yet. She was the 4th officer to give him something real. By the end of Tuesday, she was one of 8. That evening, Jeremy sat alone in his office with his encrypted tablet and his notebook side by side. The notebook had 12 names now, 4 directly documented incidents with dates and witnesses, a clear picture of a machine that had been running in the dark for a very long time. He cross-referenced everything against the dossier he had built over the previous 3 months. The patterns lined up exactly. The complaints that were filed and vanished. The officers who left without explanation. Evan Washington at the center of it all, like a wound that had never been treated. He added Tanya Morris's account to the file. Then the others. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. In the bullpen outside, the evening shift was clocking in. Voices moved through the building. Doors opened and closed. Nolan thought he was poisoning the well. What he was actually doing was buying Jeremy time. The precinct emptied out by 6:15. The evening shift took their patrol cars. The day staff went home to their families. The building settled into its nighttime quiet. The hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional crackle of the dispatch radio, the distant sound of traffic through the windows. Jeremy stayed. He did this most evenings. Not because the work required it, though it often did. He stayed because the building told you different things when it was empty. The paperwork people left unfinished. The filing patterns. The small, revealing details that got covered up during the busy hours when everyone was performing for each other. He poured a fresh coffee, went back to his desk, and opened the personnel file drawer. He pulled out the one at the very back. Evan Washington. He had read it before. 3 months ago in Dean's office, then twice more at home, alone at his kitchen table with a pen and a yellow legal pad. He knew it well enough to recite the key dates from memory. But reading a file in preparation, and reading it while sitting inside the building where it happened, were 2 completely different things. He opened it now and read it like it was the first time. Evan Washington had graduated from the academy ranked 4th in his class. His evaluations were exceptional. Instructors used words like instinctive and composed under pressure and natural leader. He had been assigned to the 9th Precinct on a Tuesday in late October, 3 years ago. The first 6 months of his file read like a success story. Commendations for 2 community interventions. A letter of recognition from a Hargrove City elementary school principal. A clean record, no disciplinary actions, consistent performance reviews marked exceeds expectations. Then the file changed. Month 7. Reassigned from the North District patrol route to the East Side Industrial Corridor. The worst route in the precinct. High call volume, inadequate backup coverage, systematically avoided by senior officers. No explanation noted in the file. Month 8. First write-up. Failure to complete post-incident documentation within the required window. Jeremy looked at the date and cross-referenced it against the duty roster he had quietly pulled last week. Evan had been working a double shift that day, covering for an officer whose absence was approved by Nolan personally. Month 9. Second write-up. Insubordination. The details were vague to the point of being meaningless. Failure to comply with supervisory directive. With no specifics, no witnesses named, no documentation of what the directive actually was. Month 10. Formal complaint filed by Evan. Targeted harassment. Discriminatory shift assignments. Hostile work environment. 3 pages, detailed and specific, with dates and incident descriptions. Jeremy turned to the next page. The complaint had been routed through the precinct's internal review process. The reviewer was listed as Sergeant Frank Nolan, finding insufficient evidence to support the claim. Complaint dismissed. Evan had never been notified of the outcome. There was no record of anyone informing him. His copy of the dismissal notice, which protocol required be delivered in person, had never been signed for. Nolan had buried it without leaving a fingerprint. Month 11. Evan filed a transfer request. It was denied within 48 hours, faster than the standard processing time, which typically took 2 weeks. The denial was signed by Nolan. Month 12. Evan Washington submitted his resignation. 2 sentences, no explanation, no exit interview conducted. The file ended there. Jeremy closed it slowly. He sat with it in his hands for a long moment. The building was quiet around him. Somewhere down the hall, a door swung shut on its hinge. He thought about what Dean had told him. Working at an auto parts store. Won't return my calls. He thought about a 29-year-old man who had wanted this, who had been 4th in his class, who had gotten a letter from an elementary school principal, who had put his uniform in a box and tried to pretend the whole thing hadn't happened, because fighting it felt like throwing himself at a wall that didn't move. Jeremy set the file on the desk. He picked up his pen and turned to a fresh page in his notebook. He wrote Evan's name at the top. Beneath it, he began a clean, organized summary of every documented incident. Dates, file references, cross-references to other officers' accounts. Precise. Thorough. The kind of documentation that couldn't be dismissed. He thought about calling Evan tonight. He decided against it. The case wasn't strong enough yet. Bringing Evan in too early meant exposing him before the protection was fully in place. When he called, the ground needed to be solid. He owed Evan Washington that much. He worked until 9:02 p.m. Then he locked the file in his desk, turned off the light, and walked out through a building that had no idea what was coming. Wednesday morning arrived with a hard frost. Jeremy was at his desk by 7:15. He ran the morning briefing at 8:30. Clean, professional, no drama. He assigned 2 patrol rotations, reviewed an open case file with a junior detective, and spent the next 2 hours conducting the final orientation meetings with the last group of officers he hadn't reached yet. He was back at his desk by noon. He was reading through a stack of misdirected administrative reports, the ones Nolan's rerouting had delayed, when his phone rang. It was Dean. "Turn on the news," she said. "Channel 4. Frank Nolan made his call from the precinct parking lot at 8:05 a.m. Not from his desk, not from his personal office, from the far corner of the lot, near the equipment bay, where the outdoor cameras didn't reach. He stood with his back to the building and his collar turned up against the cold, and he dialed Gerald Dolson's private cell phone number. Dolson picked up on the second ring. "We have a problem," Nolan said. He talked for 11 minutes. He laid it out carefully. Cole's appointment, the cafeteria setup, the individual officer meetings that were clearly not just orientation sessions. He told Dolson about the cooperation agreement he suspected was circulating. He told him about Don Keller spending 45 minutes behind a closed door with the new captain on day 1. "I need noise," Nolan said. Public noise. Something that makes him look like the problem before he can make me look like the problem. Dolson was quiet for a moment. Leave it with me, he said. Councilman Gerald Dolson was 61 years old, silver-haired, and wore the particular polish of a man who had spent 3 decades making problems disappear for the right people. He chaired the city's police funding committee, which meant the 9th Precinct's budget ran through his hands every fiscal year. He and Nolan had an arrangement that was never written down, and never needed to be. Nolan kept the 9th running the way Dolson needed it to run. Quietly, without the kind of headlines that created oversight committees, and Dolson kept the money flowing and the questions minimal. It was a clean arrangement. Cole threatened to make it very messy. By 10:00 a.m., Dolson had called 2 community board members and a local television producer he had known for 15 years. By noon, he had scheduled a community meeting for that evening under the banner of Public Safety Accountability Forum. The invitations went out through the City Council's official communication channels, which gave it the appearance of legitimacy. By 6 p.m., Channel 4 had a camera crew in the meeting room. Jeremy watched it from his office with the volume low. Dolson stood at a podium before a half-filled community room, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling civic concern. He talked about the importance of leadership continuity at the 9th Precinct. He talked about the community's relationship with their local officers. And then, with the practiced ease of a man who had been planting suggestions his whole career, he raised his concerns about the selection process that had produced the 9th Precinct's new commanding officer. Our community deserves leadership with deep local roots, Dolson said, looking directly into the camera. Leadership that understands the specific challenges of Hargrove City, not appointments made in back rooms by people with political agendas. He never said Jeremy's name directly. He didn't need to. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Questions surround new 9th Precinct captain's appointment. Jeremy turned the television off. He called Dean. Dolson chairs the funding committee, she said before he could speak. He's politically untouchable right now. Taking a direct run at him would create more noise than it solves. I know, Jeremy said. He's trying to delegitimize you before you can build traction. Make you look like the controversy so nobody looks at Nolan. I know that too. A pause. So, what do you do? Nothing, Jeremy said. Not yet. He hung up. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote 2 words. Political infrastructure. Beneath that, in clean, even letters, Gerald Dolson. He looked at the name for a long moment. Dolson thought this was about a job title, about a rejected application, and a bruised ego, and a political appointment he wanted reversed. He thought this was small. He had no idea what was actually inside the folder sitting in Jeremy's locked desk drawer. He had no idea how long Jeremy had been building it, or what it would look like when it was finished. Jeremy capped his pen. He went back to work. The precinct was nearly empty by 11. A skeleton crew ran the overnight desk. 2 officers were out on late patrol. The hallways were dim, the building breathing its slow nighttime breath. The hum of servers in the equipment room, the distant squawk of the dispatch radio, the occasional creak of the old heating system working against the cold. Dawn Keller sat alone at a terminal in the records room with a cup of cold coffee and a growing sense of unease. Her authorized access to the precinct's historical complaints database had been granted at Jeremy's request, quietly processed through official channels that afternoon. On paper, she was conducting a routine records audit, the kind of administrative task that nobody looked twice at. In practice, she was working her way backward through 6 years of filed complaints, cross-referencing dismissal dates, reviewer signatures, and routing logs. Every thread led to the same place. Every single one. She had been at it for 2 hours when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She minimized her screen without thinking about it. The footsteps passed. She exhaled. She was reaching for her coffee when she noticed the light. Nolan's office was directly across the hall from the records room. It was always locked. She had never once seen that door open when Nolan wasn't physically present. But right now, at 11:34 p.m. on a Wednesday, the door was standing open 3 inches, and the desk lamp inside was on. She sat very still. She could hear him somewhere down the hall. The men's room, she thought, from the direction of his footsteps. She didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Then she stood up slowly, crossed the hallway, and looked through the gap in the door. The office was cluttered the way powerful men's offices get cluttered. Not from disorganization, but from accumulation. Years of favors and files, and the comfortable mess of a man who never expected anyone to go through his things. The desk was covered in papers. And there, half hidden beneath a manila folder on the left side of the desk, was a locked metal drawer that had been left slightly ajar. Protruding from the lock, barely an inch, just the end of it, was a small black USB drive, personal, unmarked, completely separate from any department system. Dawn's heart was beating very fast. She did not touch the door. She did not step inside. She pulled her phone from her pocket, angled it through the gap, and took 3 photographs: the drawer, the drive, the full desk in context. Clean and clear. She was back at her terminal with her screen restored when Nolan's footsteps came back down the hall. She heard his office door pull shut. The lock clicked. She stared at her screen without reading it. Then she opened her messages and texted Jeremy 2 words and the 3 photographs. His office. He arrived in 23 minutes. Civilian clothes, no markings. He came through the side entrance without announcement and found her in the records room. She showed him the photographs on her phone. He looked at them without speaking. He expanded the image of the drive, studied it, then set the phone down on the table between them. He went very still in the way she was beginning to recognize, not hesitation, but the particular quiet of a man running calculations faster than he was letting on. A personal drive kept completely off department systems, he said finally. Locked separately from his main files. He paused. That's either Nolan's insurance policy or it's evidence of something we haven't found yet. How do we get it? Legally? Internal Affairs subpoena. Possibly a warrant. He looked at her. Which means bringing more people into this before I'm ready. More exposure. More risk. Dawn understood what he wasn't saying. Every additional person in the circle was another potential leak. And one leak was all Nolan needed. So what do? We document what you found, exactly as you found it. And we wait until the case is strong enough that the subpoena is airtight. He picked up her phone and handed it back. You did everything right tonight. She nodded. She gathered her things. They walked out together through the side door into the parking lot. The cold hit them immediately. Dawn stopped. Both front tires of her car were flat, not slowly deflated, slashed clean. The cuts were deliberate and deep. She looked at them for a moment without speaking. There's no camera on this corner, she said quietly. No, Jeremy said. There isn't. He took out his phone and photographed the tires methodically, close up, wide angle, the surrounding lot. He checked his watch and made a call to the city fleet manager's emergency line, requesting camera installation at the northeast corner of the lot. Official channels, on the record, time-stamped. He hung up and looked at her. They're guessing, he said. They don't know what you've told me. This is a warning based on suspicion, not information. Does that make it better? He met her eyes. No. It makes them sloppy. And sloppy people make mistakes. They can't walk back. He drove her to her sister's house. Neither of them said much along the way. Thursday morning felt different. Jeremy noticed it the moment he walked through the front door at 7:20 a.m. It was subtle. The kind of shift you felt before you could name it. Officers who had been keeping their eyes down all week made brief, direct contact as he passed. A junior officer held the equipment room door open for him without being asked. The usual cluster that formed around Nolan's corner of the bullpen was thinner this morning, the orbit looser. Small things. But Jeremy had built careers out of reading small things. He set 2 folders on his desk. One was the completed internal affairs referral. 31 pages, fully documented, cross-referenced, airtight. The other was a sealed envelope addressed to Deputy Chief Dean. He placed them both in the center of his desk, squared them up, and went to run the briefing. Nolan showed up for the briefing but had nowhere to stand. Jeremy was already at the podium when the room filled. He ran it the way he had run every briefing this week. Clean, direct, thorough. Shift assignments, patrol updates, 2 case reviews. He asked specific questions of specific officers and listened to the answers fully, which was something this room hadn't seen in a long time. Nolan sat in his usual chair and had nothing to do with any of it. He tried to interject twice. Small things, framed as helpful additions. Jeremy acknowledged both with a brief nod and continued without incorporating either. Not dismissively, not rudely, simply without yielding any ground. By the time the briefing ended, Nolan looked like a man sitting in a chair that had been moved 3 inches to the left of where it was supposed to be. Nothing dramatic, just wrong enough to be felt. 3 officers stopped Jeremy in the hallway afterward. Not together, separately, one after another, in the 20 minutes between the briefing and his first scheduled meeting. Each one found a quiet moment, a stretch of empty corridor, and said some version of the same thing. The first was Officer Damon Hicks, 24 years old and 6 months on the force. He stopped Jeremy near the water fountain and spoke quickly, quietly, like a man who had been working up to this for days. He described a pattern of assignments deliberately designed to set him up to fail. Impossible quotas, inadequate backup, write-ups that appeared in his file without warning. He hadn't filed a complaint. He hadn't known if there was any point. The second was a woman named Officer Patty Marsh. 10 years on the force, the last 4 at the 9th. She handed Jeremy a folded piece of paper, a copy of a complaint she had filed 2 years ago, personally routed to Nolan, never heard of again. She had kept her copy because something had told her to. The third said only 3 sentences, asked for nothing, and walked away. Jeremy added all of it to the file. Dean arrived at noon. She came without announcement, through the back entrance, in plain clothes, a gray coat and a leather portfolio under her arm. Jeremy met her in his office and closed the door. He slid the referral across the desk. She read it the way she read everything, thoroughly, without expression, turning each page with the same controlled attention. It took her 22 minutes. Jeremy drank his coffee and waited. When she finished, she closed the folder and set it flat on the desk. She looked at him. "This is enough," she said. "I know. I can have formal suspension paperwork drawn up tonight. We move on Nolan first thing tomorrow. Badge, sidearm, administrative hold pending full investigation. The harassment record goes to HR and the union simultaneously." She paused. "He won't see it coming." "No," Jeremy said. "He won't." She studied him for a moment. "How are you doing?" He considered the question. "Ask me Friday afternoon." She almost smiled. She gathered the referral into her portfolio and stood. "First thing tomorrow," she said. "First thing tomorrow," he confirmed. After she left, Jeremy sat alone in his office for a few minutes. The building moved around him. Phones, footsteps, the ordinary sounds of a working precinct. He opened his desk drawer and took out Evan Washington's file. He set it on the desk in front of him and looked at it. He thought about a 29-year-old man at an auto parts store who had stopped believing anything would happen. He let himself feel it, just for a moment, the quiet, solid satisfaction of a thing nearly finished. Then he put the file away. He sealed the referral envelope. He locked it in the bottom drawer of his desk and turned the key. Outside the glass, across the bullpen, Frank Nolan stood completely motionless, watching the office door. Jeremy turned off his desk lamp and went back to work. Jeremy's phone rang at 9:47 p.m. He was still at his desk. The building was dark except for the lamp in his office and the blue glow of the overnight dispatch terminal down the hall. He had been reviewing Dawn's photographs of the USB drive one more time, thinking about timelines, thinking about warrants, thinking about how much longer he needed before the net was fully closed. He looked at the screen. Dean. He picked up. Jeremy. Her voice was different, clipped, controlled in the specific way of someone who had received very bad news and was managing it with both hands. We have a problem. He set down his pen. Tell me. She talked for 9 minutes. He listened without interrupting. He sat completely still in his chair with one hand flat on the desk, and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, processing everything she said with the same careful attention he gave to everything. Not reacting, not catastrophizing, just taking it in. The structure of what had happened became clear quickly. Nolan had moved first. Sometime between the morning briefing and noon, he had contacted Councilman Dolson. Dolson had spent the afternoon working his connections at the city level, calling in debts, applying pressure through channels that never appeared in any official record. By 6 p.m., the Deputy Commissioner's office had quietly signed a bureaucratic restructuring order. The Internal Affairs Unit assigned to receive Jeremy's referral had been pulled and reassigned to a district reorganization project. Administrative language, buried in routine paperwork, signed on a Thursday afternoon when nobody was paying close attention. The replacement unit, Dean said. It's the North Side Division. They have a history with the 9th. Jeremy knew what that meant. He had read those records too. 3 complaints referred to Northside IA in the last 4 years. 3 findings of insufficient evidence, clean as a whistle, every time. There's more, Dean said. Of course there was. Someone tipped Nolan about the referral. I don't know who and I don't know when, but he knew it was coming. A pause. He filed a formal union grievance this afternoon. Claims your Monday observation, arriving in plain clothes, failing to identify yourself as commanding officer, constituted deliberate psychological manipulation and created undue stress for department personnel. The room was very quiet. He's calling it entrapment, she said. He's calling my first day on the job entrapment, Jeremy said flatly. He's calling it whatever word makes the union move fastest. Another pause, heavier than the last. Jeremy, Ellison and Holt have signed supporting statements. 4 officers total. The grievance is already filed. Jeremy closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them. The union is backing it? The union is reviewing it, which at this stage means the same thing. And Dolson... She stopped. Dolson's brother-in-law is the deputy commissioner. There it was, the full shape of it. Not just Nolan, not just Dolson. The deputy commissioner himself, connected by blood and aligned by interest, signing the paperwork that surgically removed the one channel designed to receive everything Jeremy had built. By tomorrow morning, Dean continued, Dolson will be on the news calling for a formal review of your appointment. The union will be citing the grievance publicly. And the deputy commissioner, she stopped again, will back them both, Jeremy said. Yes. The silence that followed had weight to it. Jeremy looked at the sealed envelope in his desk drawer. 31 pages, 6 years of documented abuse. Every complaint, every suppressed transfer, every name, every date. All of it real, all of it thorough, all of it completely useless without a legitimate channel to receive it. Nolan hadn't beaten the evidence. He had beaten the system that was supposed to process it. "Go home," Dean said quietly. "Get some rest. We'll figure this out tomorrow." "Yes," Jeremy said. "Good night, Anita." He hung up. He sat in the lamplight without moving for a long time. The building was silent around him. The referral envelope sat in the locked drawer 12 inches from his right hand. The same envelope he had sealed with such quiet satisfaction just hours ago, certain that tomorrow morning would be the beginning of the end. He had been right about that, just not in the way he had expected. He reached over and turned off the desk lamp. In the darkness of his office, in an empty building, with a case that could not currently be filed, Jeremy Cole sat very still and thought. He thought for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and scrolled to a number he had not dialed yet. Evan Washington. His thumb hovered over the screen. He pressed call. Evan Washington picked up on the fourth ring. His voice was thick with sleep, and something older than sleep. A wariness that had settled into him the way things settle when they've been there long enough to stop feeling like a choice. "Hello? Evan?" Jeremy kept his voice quiet and steady. "My name is Jeremy Cole. I'm the new captain at the 9th Precinct." Silence. Not the silence of a man who had fallen back asleep. The silence of a man who had gone very still on the other end of the line. "I've read your file," Jeremy continued. "All of it. Every complaint. Every write-up. Every date." He paused. "I know what they did to you in that building." The silence stretched another few seconds. Then Evan Washington said, "I wondered when somebody would call." They talked for 2 hours. Jeremy sat at his kitchen table in the dark, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and his notebook open in front of him, and he listened the way he had trained himself to listen over 28 years. Completely. Without rushing. Without filling the quiet spaces with his own voice. Evan talked slowly, at first. Carefully. The way you talk about something that hurt you badly when you're not yet sure the person on the other end deserves the full truth of it. He talked about his first months at the 9th, the commendations, the school letter, the genuine belief that he had found the place where he was supposed to be. Then he talked about what came after, the patrol reassignments, the write-ups that appeared in his file like ambushes, the complaint he filed in month 10 that vanished without a response, the transfer request that came back denied in 48 hours, the morning he sat in his car outside the precinct for 45 minutes and then drove home instead of going in. "I kept journals," Evan said. Jeremy looked up from his notebook. "What kind of journals?" "Personal ones. Dated entries. Every incident, every conversation, every time something happened that I knew was wrong." A pause. "I wrote them because I didn't know what else to do with it. I couldn't sleep. I'd come home and write it all down just to get it out of my head." His voice was flat and factual, the voice of a man describing something he had processed 1,000 times already. "I never filed them. I didn't think anyone would listen." "I'm listening," Jeremy said. Another silence. Longer this time. "I have a daughter," Evan said. "She's 4. Her name is Amara." He stopped. "I need you to tell me this is real. That something is actually going to happen this time and I'm not just—" "It's real," Jeremy said. "But I need to ask something difficult." "Ask it." "I need you to come back to the building. Not tonight. Tomorrow morning. In uniform." He waited. "I know what I'm asking." The silence on the other end was the longest yet. "You want me to walk back in there?" Evan said quietly. "Yes." "In front of all of them?" "Yes." Jeremy heard him breathe. Once, slowly, in and out. "Tell me what you have," Evan said. Jeremy told him. Not everything, not the operational details, not the names he was still protecting, but enough. The dossier, the documented pattern. The 6 years of suppressed complaints. The scope of what was coming. When he finished, Evan was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay. Tell me what time." Jeremy hung up and sat with the phone in his hand. It was 2:47 a.m. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he had added 3 months ago and hoped he wouldn't need to use this soon. Harriet Nolan, U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. He had sent her the preliminary dossier as a precaution in December, when Dean first approached him, and the full scope of what he was walking into had become clear. He hadn't been certain the case would reach federal territory. He was certain now. The moment Dolson's brother-in-law signed that IA reassignment order, the case crossed a line. Interfering with an active civil rights inquiry, even through bureaucratic maneuvering, even with clean hands and administrative language, was a federal matter. He pressed call. She picked up on the second ring. She had been awake. "Jeremy," she said simply. "The IA unit was pulled tonight," he said. "Signed by the deputy commissioner. Dolson's brother-in-law." A pause, brief and precise. "That's obstruction," she said. "Yes." "Of a federal civil rights inquiry." "Yes." He heard the click of a lamp, the sound of paper moving. "The door just opened," Collins said. Jeremy looked out his kitchen window at the dark, empty street. "Be at the 9th Precinct at 8:30 tomorrow morning," he said. "Use the front entrance." "We'll be there," she said. He hung up. He closed his notebook. He did not sleep. Jeremy arrived at 7:45 a.m. in full dress uniform. Gold bars. Polished shoes. Every crease is sharp enough to cut. He walked through the front entrance of the 9th Precinct, with his shoulders back and his face composed, and he went directly to the briefing room, where he stood at the front and waited. He didn't pace. He didn't check his watch. He stood the way he had stood his entire career, like a man who had already decided how things were going to go and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Officers began filtering in at 8:00. They came in pairs and clusters, mid-conversation, coffee in hand, still half asleep. One by one they registered him at the front of the room in full dress uniform, and the conversations dropped off, and the room filled in quietly. Nolan arrived at 8:20. He came through the door already carrying confidence like a weapon. Back-channel confirmation had reached him through the union that the removal review was set for 10:42 a.m., that Dolson was prepared to make a statement at noon, that the deputy commissioner's office was ready to move. He expected to walk into a room with a cornered man at the front of it. He found Jeremy Cole standing at the podium like he owned the building, because he did. Nolan took his seat. His expression gave away nothing. But Jeremy watched his eyes make a quick calculation, a rapid reassessment of the room, the uniform, the posture, and come up uncertain for the first time all week. Good. At 8:25, Dawn Keller came in and took a seat near the back. She looked at Jeremy briefly. He gave her nothing, but she understood. At 8:28, Deputy Chief Dean entered through the side door in full dress uniform and positioned herself to the right of the podium without a word. Several officers straightened involuntarily in their seats. At 8:30, Jeremy heard the front door of the precinct open. The room didn't hear them coming. It felt them. A change in the air near the hallway entrance. A shift in the building's atmosphere, like pressure changing before a storm. Then the briefing room door opened, and 3 people walked in, displaying federal credentials. Harriet Nolan was 52 years old, compact and precise, with the bearing of a woman who had spent 25 years in federal courtrooms and had never once lost her footing in one. She wore a dark suit and carried a leather portfolio, and she walked to the side of the room without hurrying and without looking at anyone in particular, which somehow made everyone in the room look at her. Her 2 DOJ colleagues positioned themselves near the door. The room was completely silent. Then the door opened a second time. Evan Washington walked in. He was 29 years old, and he wore his old dress uniform, pressed and straight, the crease in the trousers sharp, the shoes mirror bright. He had clearly spent time on it. He stood in the doorway for just a moment, and Jeremy could see what it cost him to be here, in this building, in front of these people. He could see it in the set of his jaw and the way his hands stayed perfectly still at his sides through what had to be an enormous act of will. He found a place to stand near the left wall. His eyes moved once across the room and settled on Nolan. Nolan looked back at him, and something passed across his face that he couldn't fully suppress. A flash of something raw and ugly, there and gone in an instant. Jeremy stepped to the podium. "Good morning," he said. "Before we begin, I have some introductions to make." He introduced Colin and her colleagues. He stated her title and her division clearly and without drama, the way you state facts that don't require decoration. Colin stepped forward. "The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has opened a formal federal investigation into this precinct," she said. Her voice was measured and absolute. "The investigation covers systematic civil rights violations, racially discriminatory conduct, targeted harassment of officers, suppression of formal complaints, and obstruction of a civil rights inquiry." She looked at the room without expression. "This investigation is now active and federal in jurisdiction." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nobody moved. Jeremy turned slightly. "Officer Washington," he said quietly, "would you like to say anything?" Evan Washington looked directly at Frank Nolan. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear, and left no room for misunderstanding. "I came back to make sure my daughter grows up in a city where this doesn't happen to the next one." The room was silent enough to hear the lights hum. Nobody spoke for a long moment after Evan sat down. The silence was enormous. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight, filling every corner, settling over every officer like a judgment they couldn't escape. Men who had laughed in the cafeteria on Monday morning sat with their eyes fixed on the table in front of them. Men who had signed their names to Nolan's grievance without a second thought stared at the wall like they were looking for a door that wasn't there. Nobody looked at Nolan. Nolan looked at nothing. Deputy Chief Dean stepped forward. She held a single sheet of paper in her right hand. She moved to the front of the room with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who understood that speed would rob this moment of what it deserved. She had waited a long time for this. She was not going to rush it. "Sergeant Frank Nolan." The name landed like a stone dropped in still water. Nolan looked up. His face had gone somewhere that faces go when every defense a man has built over 22 years collapses at the same moment. A rigid, terrible blankness, like a building the second after the walls come down and before the dust has settled. He was performing composure. His body was betraying him anyway. "Effective immediately," Dean said, her voice filling every inch of the room. "You are placed on administrative suspension, pending the outcome of the federal civil rights investigation opened this morning by the Department of Justice. You will surrender your badge and your sidearm before leaving this building." She stopped speaking. The room waited. Nolan stood. The movement was slow and stiff, like a man whose body had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. He straightened his jacket with both hands. A habit, muscle memory, something to do with his hands while the room watched. He reached to his belt and unclipped his badge and stood there for just a moment, holding it in his palm. 22 years. He set it on the table. The sound it made, that small, flat, metallic click against the surface, was the loudest thing in the room. Several officers flinched at it without meaning to. He unholstered his sidearm. He cleared it with the mechanical efficiency of long practice and placed it beside the badge. His hands were shaking, both of them. A fine, uncontrollable tremor that ran from his wrists to his fingertips and did not stop. He stepped back from the table. He straightened his jacket again, that same useless gesture, his hands needing somewhere to go, and he walked toward the door. His back was straight. His face was empty. He didn't look at Lennox. He didn't look at Ellison. He didn't look at Holt, who had laughed the loudest on Monday morning and was now staring at her own hands in her lap like she didn't recognize them. He didn't look at Evan Washington. But he passed within 4 feet of him on the way to the door. Evan didn't move, didn't speak, stood absolutely still with his hands at his sides and watched Nolan pass with an expression that carried 3 years of a man's life in it. 3 years of the worst kind of quiet. The kind that settles over you when you've been told, over and over, by the weight of institutional silence, that what happened to you didn't matter. It mattered. The door swung shut behind Nolan with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Harriet Collins stepped forward. She opened her portfolio with both hands and looked at the room, not searching for anyone, not avoiding anyone, just looking. The look of a woman who had walked into many rooms like this one and understood exactly what they were. Officer Bryce Lennox. Lennox looked up from the table, and for one unguarded second, his face was completely open. Stripped of the grin, stripped of the performance, stripped of everything that Monday morning had been built on. What was underneath it was something much smaller than the man who had stood over Jeremy with a creamer cup and an audience at his back. You are hereby formally charged with conduct unbecoming an officer, assault under color of law, and violation of the civil rights of a commanding officer. Collins' voice didn't rise or fall. It didn't need to. Every word was a wall. These charges have been filed with the Department of Justice and are supported by documented evidence, time-stamped records, eyewitness accounts, and the sworn statement of Captain Jeremy Cole. You are suspended without pay effective immediately. You will surrender your credentials before leaving this building. Lennox's mouth opened. Something started to come out of it. A protest. A reflex. The last automatic reach for a world where he could still talk his way out of something. The look on Collins' face stopped it cold. He stood up. His fingers fumbled with the badge pin. Once, twice, 3 times before it came free. He set it on the table with a hand that couldn't quite hold steady. He didn't look at Jeremy. He looked at nothing, the same way Nolan had looked at nothing. The same vacancy that descends on men when the thing they built their identity around is taken away in front of witnesses. He walked out. The door swung shut again. Ellison and Holt came next. When Collins spoke their names, Ellison's jaw worked like a man trying to chew through something too hard for his teeth. He was informed that his signed statement, the one he had put his name on without hesitation to help bury a captain who had done nothing wrong, had been flagged as potential evidence of coordinated retaliation against a commanding officer. Federal evidence now, in a federal case. His face collapsed through 3 expressions in 4 seconds. Holt said nothing. She sat with both hands flat on the table, pressing down like she needed to feel something solid, and she stared at a fixed point on the wall, and she did not cry, but it was close. She had laughed. She had sat at that table on Monday morning, and she had laughed, and she had known on some level, the way you always know, even when you choose not to, that it was wrong. Now the bill had come. The consequences reached City Hall before noon. Councilman Dolson's attorney called at 10:43 with language that made Dolson sit down mid-sentence. Federal obstruction. Not a city matter. Not something managed quietly through a funding committee over lunch. The IA reassignment, the move Dolson had been so proud of, so certain was clean, had been identified in the federal case file, and it was sitting in front of people who did not owe Gerald Dolson anything at all. He canceled the press conference. He did not return calls for the rest of the day. By 11:15, the Deputy Commissioner's office released a 4-sentence public statement of full support for the DOJ investigation. His brother-in-law's name did not appear in it. The briefing room emptied slowly, like water finding its way out. Junior officers filed past Jeremy with expressions he hadn't seen from them all week. Something open, something cautious, but real. A few made eye contact. One nodded. One, a young officer Jeremy recognized from his orientation meetings, stopped briefly beside Evan Washington on the way out and said quietly, "I'm glad you came back." Evan looked at him for a moment. "Me too," he said. Dawn Keller was last. She stood in the doorway and looked back at the room, at the empty chairs, at the table that had held so many years of silence and complicity, at Jeremy, who stood at the front, with his hands loose at his sides and his uniform straight, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has finished something that needed finishing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked out into the hallway. And for the first time in 4 years at the 9th Precinct, she didn't brace herself as she went. She just walked. The precinct was quieter than Jeremy had ever heard it. Not empty. The phones still rang. The dispatch radio still crackled. Officers still moved through the hallways with cases to work and shifts to complete. But the particular noise that had defined this building all week, the performative loudness, the laughter that was really something else wearing laughter's clothes, was gone. The air itself felt different, cleaner somehow, like a window had been opened in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. Jeremy sat across from Dean in his office with 2 cups of coffee between them, and the afternoon light coming through the blinds in long, flat lines across the floor. She told him about the reform package. Mandatory body cameras for all in-precinct interactions, not just street patrol, but inside the building itself. A fully restructured complaints process that routed directly to an independent oversight board, bypassing the precinct chain of command entirely. A new community accountability panel with real authority and real teeth, and a formal implementation committee to build all of it from the ground up. "The city wants you to chair it," Dean said. Jeremy looked at his coffee. "They want it done right," she continued. "And they know what right looks like now." He nodded slowly. She opened her portfolio and set a single page on the desk between them. He looked at it without picking it up. 5 officers who had filed transfer requests from this precinct withdrew them this week, she said. Voluntarily. No prompting. He read the names on the page, all 5 of them. He recognized every one, from orientation meetings, from hallway conversations, from the careful, frightened way they had moved through this building at the start of the week, including Dawn Keller. He sat with that for a moment. "That," he said quietly, "is the whole win. Right there." Dean looked at him. "The federal case, the suspensions, the charges, that's not the win. That's the consequence," Jeremy said. "The win is the 5 people who decided to stay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she closed her portfolio and stood. "Get some rest this weekend, Jeremy." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She almost smiled. He found Dawn at her desk 20 minutes later. The bullpen was half full, the afternoon shift settling in. He stopped beside her desk and waited until she looked up. "My office," he said. 2 minutes. She came in, and he closed the door and remained standing. He didn't go behind the desk. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her directly. "What you did this week," he said, "is formally noted in the federal record. Your cooperation, your courage, and your judgment. All of it on record." She absorbed that with a short nod. "There's something else," he said. He pulled a single sheet from his desk and held it out to her. "I'm recommending you for the detective track. This is the formal application." She took it. She looked at it for a long moment. "I want to be clear," Jeremy said. "This is not a reward for what you did this week. I've watched you for 5 days. The way you think, the way you move through a situation, the way you read people." He paused. "You should have been on this track 2 years ago." Dawn looked at the page. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "My mother," she said finally, "is going to lose her mind." Something moved across Jeremy's face that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. "Tell her she raised someone worth bragging about," he said. At 1:30 p.m., Jeremy carried a lunch tray from the cafeteria line and walked to the far end of the room. He sat down at the steel table near the far wall. The same table, the same seat. The tray in front of him, the notebook beside it, the coffee black and hot. Everything was exactly as it had been on Monday morning, except the creamer cups at the condiment station, and the sound of the room and the weight of the air, and the fact that Frank Nolan was not standing in the doorway watching with a smile on his face. Jeremy set his fork down beside his tray and looked at the table for a moment. 5 days. He picked up his fork. The cafeteria door opened, and Dawn Keller walked through with her own tray. She crossed the room without being asked, without ceremony, and sat down across from him. She didn't explain herself. She didn't need to. They sat in comfortable silence. Then the door opened again. Officer Damon Hicks stood in the entrance with his lunch tray, 24 years old and 6 months on the job, looking at Jeremy with the particular uncertainty of a young man who wasn't sure of the rules of a world that had just changed. He had not laughed on Monday morning. He had not signed his name to anything. He had sat in orientation and spoken carefully and honestly, and hoped, in the quiet way that young people hope, that someone was actually listening. Jeremy looked up. "Plenty of room, Officer Hicks," he said. Hicks crossed the cafeteria and sat down. 2 more officers followed him through the door a moment later. Officer Tanya Morris, who had spent 40 minutes in Jeremy's office telling the truth about her first 6 months at the 9th, and a young officer named Marsh, who had handed Jeremy a folded piece of paper in the hallway on Thursday and asked for nothing in return. They sat down without being asked. The table filled. Jeremy looked at it for just a moment, at the faces around him, at this ordinary steel table in this ordinary cafeteria, in a building that had, 5 days ago, been a place where cruelty had a uniform, and silence was the price of survival. He picked up his fork. He ate. And outside the cafeteria windows, Hargrove City moved through its Friday afternoon, unaware, unhurried, carrying on. While inside the 9th precinct, something that had been broken for a very long time quietly, finally, began to heal. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.